Welcome to week 3 of Unit 6. This week there are actually going to be two separate PowerPoints. The first is going to be on JFK. The second will be on LBJ, on Lyndon Baines Johnson. And then next week we will move into Nixon and the Watergate scandal. So starting this with the age of Camelot, let's look at JFK and the 1960 election. So JFK, Kennedy, comes from a very wealthy family. He is Irish Catholic. He has a strong Boston accent. He is young, 43. So kind of a unique person running for president. He is going to run against Richard Nixon, who we'll see become president in 1968. Nixon at the time is very popular, is a very successful Republican. So I think in history we tend to think of this as a Kennedy blowout. It definitely was not. It was a very, very close race, one of the closest races in history. So Nixon has a strong military background, lots of experience, right? He was vice president for Eisenhower for 8 years. And while we know typically that vice presidents don't do a ton when they're in office, it does give you a lot of experience in seeing what the president does and knowing what the expectations are. So he has a lot going for him going in. JFK doesn't have a lot of experience, no foreign policy experience at all, which is going to be really big with all the Soviet Union stuff going on. But he does offer a new face to leadership, right? When Eisenhower is done being president at the age of 70, while everyone liked Eisenhower, and he actually, if there hadn't been term limits at this time, right, had thoughts, people talked about him having a third term. He didn't really do a lot in the end, right? He was calm, he was, this military hero, but there wasn't the change that people were coming to want from the 60s, right? We go into the 60s with this counterculture and the Cold War going on, and people kind of are expecting and wanting new and fresh. So we see this here with Kennedy always looking tan. He's got this beautiful wife and these cute little kids. Jackie Kennedy was always dressed to perfection. Everyone modeled after her. Everyone loved her. Their kids, that picture on the left is going to be, this iconic picture of their son, right? That will be around forever. Now, Kennedy's vision for America, his plan, most presidents have like a nickname for what they hope to achieve for their package, and his would be called the New Frontier. He was really into space and New Frontier, and he ran on this idea that the United States had a missile gap with the Soviet Union, as in we were falling behind. He also runs on a civil rights platform, which is why he doesn't do too well on the South. And he believes one of his things that he really wants to have or accomplish is the Civil Rights Act that he'll bring forward. Now, he is never able to pass it because he creates a lot of divide with the Senate and the House. Johnson will actually end up passing this bill after Kennedy is assassinated. So Johnson, who was his vice president for the 3 years that Kennedy was president, Johnson didn't really have much of a role. He wasn't very popular with all of Kennedy's buddies, but he will end up getting it passed because he is known as this negotiator. A couple things that Kennedy was known for that he did do as part of his New Frontier was he created the Peace Corps. Peace Corps is still around today, though not as big as it was during the 70s and 80s. But this would train and send Americans to all these different countries to support them in many different ways. And it was more of showing American goodwill to other countries and that we were willing to support them and hoping to make better relations, especially with this whole Cold War drama. Which side are you going to pick? We have these Latin American countries and African countries that are kind of trying to decide which way they should go with their government, which side they should follow in the Cold War. And so we wanted to kind of show American goodwill in that way. Now, going back to Eisenhower in the 50s, in 1957, and this is where that whole missile gap came in, right? The Soviets launched Sputnik, which made us look like we were falling behind. And so in 1959, then President Eisenhower, founded NASA. So JFK comes in, and this is kind of one of his big things, is he feels like we need to catch up to the Soviets. And so he gives this dramatic speech that by the end of the decade, we will put a man on the moon. And he doesn't live to see it, but we do, right? So we do accomplish this. If you haven't seen Hidden Figures yet, go and watch that. That's a big one connected to that. So let's get into the foreign affairs and the drama that will consume nearly a year of his presidency, and that has to do with Cuba. So in 1959, so this is still the end of Eisenhower's presidency, Fidel Castro, leads a revolution in Cuba, a communist revolution, overthrows the government that had been pro-American, and takes control of Cuba. He takes all the private property, right? We're going into communism here. He gets military and financial support from the Soviets, and becomes very anti-American, which they still are today, right? This has been a never-ending thing now. But the big drama in Cuba, first off, is communism is getting too close to home, and second, that connection with the Soviets. So there are going to be two major dramas here. First off, he comes to power in 1959. Eisenhower starts to train, actually the CIA does, but this is under Eisenhower, starts to train Cubans that are exiled in Florida, and they start to train them in order to go back to Cuba and overthrow Castro. So when JFK comes in as president in 1960, this plan is kind of underway, and he will permit this plan to go through. And in that plan, you can see where the Bay of Pigs is. This will be called the Bay of Pigs incident. They will go into the Bay of Pigs, but they will not be totally supported by the United States. As soon as they land, Castro knows they're there. Castro's people pick them up. They're imprisoned. It is a complete and utter failure, and it looks like Cuba beat the United States, right? So he just looks like a fool. So then, just shortly after that, he goes and has a meeting with the leader of the Soviet Union at the time. And what is happening at this meeting is Sputnik has just gone, right? This is several years before, but still they're ahead, right, in the space race. The Bay of Pigs fiasco has just happened, and he's newly elected and doesn't have any foreign policy experience. So Kennedy tries to talk with him, and he just kind of looks like a fool. Like Khrushchev comes out of the meeting and is just like, man, who did they put in as their leader? And so he is going to try, Khrushchev is going to try and push the buttons of the United States, thinking and feeling like Kennedy is not really ready to handle the challenge. So what is Khrushchev going to do? Several things. Here comes the first one, excuse me, and that's going to be in Berlin. Now remember, Berlin is still divided into East Berlin and West Berlin. East Berlin still controlled by the Soviet Union, and this is where we will see Khrushchev is upset that all of these East Berliners are fleeing East Berlin for the safer and democratic West Berlin. And we're talking thousands are fleeing every day. Because imagine if you are in this, remember that Berlin is in the Soviet controlled, see how it says right there, the German Republic, right? So people, if they're in that Soviet controlled Germany, it's really hard to get over to the democratic half of Germany, but it's really easy to walk across to West Berlin, right? And once you seek refuge in West Berlin, you're good, right? So thousands of people are doing this every day. And JFK goes to West Berlin and stands by the border and, vows that he will leave West Berlin open to anyone that wants to come in. And Khrushchev is like, heck the no. So instead of blockading, right, we know that didn't work. They tried that before. Um, he begins to build a wall. And let's watch here the wall starting to be built. Here's our wall going up. Now it's pretty crazy, it just happens like overnight, and you can see the wall at different areas, right? But this is pretty crazy. Look at this. There's like this death strip on one side of the wall, right? And that's where the guards patrol for anyone that's trying to. And that brings us to Khrushchev's push the buttons #2, and this will be the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the wall is up. The meeting was an epic fail for JFK, and now Khrushchev has placed missiles in Cuba within range of the United States. Now, it's spy planes that see these missiles, so it's kind of hard to admit how we know that they're there, but we do. And JFK has to decide, what is he going to do? How is he going to handle this? Because if he directly calls out the Soviet Union, this could start World War III, right? The missiles are there. Like if they push the button, you know, Florida and half the eastern seaboard is gone. So he really has to be delicate in how he does this. And there's a great movie called 13 Days that are about the 13-day standoff with the Soviet Union over what to do with these missiles. So these missiles, here we go, we can see the range. So what Kennedy decides to do is he decides to blockade Cuba. So you can see all of the US ships that are surrounding Cuba that will not allow anything out or in. Now he can't actually call it a blockade because that is an act of war and we are not going to have war. So he calls it a quarantine, which is kind of ironic at this time in history. And that quarantine is not going to allow Soviet ships in and is not going to allow anything out of Cuba. So Soviet ships begin to head towards Cuba. And this is where we have an actual physical standoff between Soviet ships and American ships. And while they are having this actual standoff through back channels, right, because they can't directly talk about this, the Soviets and the American government are beginning to talk about these missiles, about exchanges, about what can happen. Now, at the end of 13 days, probably one of the best outcomes we could hope for in the war, or not in the war, but in this situation, is they do make a backwater deal. Backwater deal? Yeah. Where Khrushchev will remove the missiles. Now, they can't have the world see an actual exchange, right? Because we don't negotiate, like we don't negotiate with terrorists, right? So what happens is he removes the missiles, and a little bit later, we remove missiles that we had in Turkey that were pointed at the Soviet Union. So that's kind of a little of the pot calling the kettle black, right? We had missiles that were within striking distance of the Soviet Union in Turkey, and yet we got so upset that they were going to place missiles in Cuba. But we remove those missiles from Turkey. We do it a little bit later so it doesn't look like it's directly connected. And we also promise that we will not invade Cuba and we will allow them to have their own government and do their own thing. This also leads to the Test Ban Treaty, which says we will stop testing nuclear weapons. We had been testing them actually on islands in the Pacific. So there are several islands over there that are still completely uninhabitable because we've been testing nuclear weapons there. So after 3 years and not getting too much accomplished, but handling some really big things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, giving a speech about putting a man on the moon, establishing the Peace Corps, working on his civil rights bill, which had not been passed, JFK decides he's going to run for re-election. And part of running for re-election is campaigning. So on November 22nd, JFK and his wife head down to Dallas for a campaign parade, basically. Now, I'm going to tell you some information about the assassination itself. You don't need to know all the crazy details, but this is something that people tend to find pretty interesting. If you are into conspiracy theories, there are many, many, many of them, so feel free to look that up on your own. So Jackie and Kennedy show up in Texas for a little campaigning, hoping to reunite the Texas Democratic Party. He is also there with Johnson, LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson. That's him right there with the white flower. He is vice president. He is also from Texas. But one of the big things was, remember that JFK runs on a civil rights platform that really upsets all of the South, including Texas, right? If you remember, this is about the time the South was always Democratic, right? The South had always voted Democratic. It will be the civil rights movement that will pull the South to the Republican Party. And it's about this time that that's happening. Now, when Johnson runs as vice president, the South is super excited. They haven't had a Southern president, right? Or a Southern vice president. If he becomes vice president, he may become president. They really think it's a big deal. He had been Senate Majority Leader for a really long time, for over 20 years, and it had a lot of power. But after Kennedy becomes president and starts pushing for the civil rights, the South just abandons the Democratic Party. So they're there trying to bring them back into the fold. Jackie, of course, is looking beautiful. That pink dress will become iconic after he is shot. They had published the route of the parade because the point was presidents never come to Texas. This was a really big deal. They wanted a lot of people to be there. Kennedy knew how powerful television was. He knew how powerful it would look to have thousands of people lining the roads, people in every window waving at him. And so over 50,000 people will show up for this parade. And he will be there with the governor of Texas and the governor's wife. You can see right here, they, in their motorcade, they do have a police escort. All of his security guys are there. He does have protection, but it's an open car. Um, it really is just set up poorly to protect him. If you ever want to see a good movie about this, actually, it's more about LBJ, but it does show all of this and what happened. There's also a good movie called Parkland, which is the name of the hospital where Kennedy will be taken. So the route is publicized. People are all over there. Here's the plaza. You can see the book depository there where we believe, remember all these conspiracy theories, that Lee Harvey Oswald was waiting. Um, the shots are fired. The governor will be shot. Kennedy will be shot. One of the things that is believed, because remember he is shot twice, is that he was wearing a back brace. Because remember he had really bad back problems. So he's wearing a brace that holds him up. So after he's shot the first time, he can't truly roll down. He is still propped up by that brace, even though he's shot. So the second shot, if he hadn't been wearing that brace, may have missed him. So that's kind of an interesting point. He is rushed directly to Parkland Hospital. There is the limo that he was in. Now, Conley, the governor of Texas, was also shot. He will recover. Both the wives are in the hospital together, waiting for news on their husband, but Kennedy will be pronounced dead at 1 p.m. Now, Johnson is in the room with Kennedy when he passes away. And all of a sudden, he is president, right? And what he decides, and of course, Kennedy is surrounded by all of his best friends, right? There was a lot of talk of nepotism and that kind of thing in the Kennedy White House. His brother was his second in command, right? And so none of them like Johnson, and instantly he is president and starts to make all these decisions. And the one big decision he makes is he wants to be sworn in as president right away. He doesn't want to wait to get back to Washington. He believes that there needs to be a continuity in government. And so what he does is on Air Force One, he is sworn in as president. And a couple key things with this, which are just really interesting. You'll notice there on his left, that's Jackie. She is still wearing the pink dress. There's still blood on it. But he asks her to stand with him to show unity between Kennedy and Johnson, which is pretty crazy. You can just see the look on her face. I mean, her husband has just been killed. Lady Bird, Johnson's wife, is on his right wearing the pearls and the white dress. And in an interesting twist, one of the things that Johnson had tried to do as vice president, that he had promised the Southern governments, was get more conservative judges into higher positions. And the woman right there swearing him in was one of those judges that he had tried to get into a higher position, and he had been told no by the Kennedys. So when he found out he was going to become president, first thing he did, because she was from Texas, was called her up and got her there, and she's the one that swore him in, and he would place her into a position of higher power after he becomes president. So one other interesting note here was that Jackie would not go back to Washington, D.C. without her husband. And so they have to find this special device that is going to bring the coffin. They have to get a coffin like right away. They have to get Kennedy into the coffin. They have to get him into the plane, onto Air Force One, and he is flown back with his entourage and Johnson, the new president, Lady Bird, and Jackie. So you can see right there, that's the movement of Kennedy's body. Now, we are going to go with what the government says is the official story on Kennedy's assassination. Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested shortly after for killing Kennedy. He was former military, but become kind of anti-US government. He supported Castro. He visited Eastern Europe. He believed in communism. And when he is arrested, he says that he is just a fall guy, that there is a bigger conspiracy surrounding Kennedy's murder. And there may have been, but we will never get to hear his story, because when he's being transferred to be put on trial, he is shot and killed by a Dallas nightclub owner named Jack Ruby. That's him right there. You can see the picture, who is said to have connections to the mob. And one of the conspiracy theories was that Kennedy was killed by the mob, not by communists. Others believe he might have been killed by the Soviets. There's just a lot of different theories around what could have happened. And we see right there Jackie and the presidential funeral, the motorcade, and his son saluting, because he saw all the other soldiers saluting as the casket rolled by. Now, the last piece here is that Johnson commissioned a report, a study, to determine if there were any other conspirators, if Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. And after much research, the Warren Commission said that Oswald acted alone in killing the president, and that there was no conspiracy. Now, a decade later, the US government will issue another report with more research saying it was probably likely that there was a conspiracy and that others were involved, but they were never able to prove it.